May 1925. The Hôtel de Crillon, Place de la Concorde, Paris. 6 scrap metal dealers sit down with a government official who does not exist to bid on a landmark that is not for sale. Track the method. Start with the name because the name is already a lie. He was born Victor Lustig on the 4th of January 1890 in Hostiny, a small town in Bohemia, then part of Austria-Hungary, today the Czech Republic. Not French, not aristocratic, not a count. The title, Count Victor Lustig, was a piece of costume jewelry he put on somewhere in his 20s and never took off. And it worked for the same reason a good fake ID works. Nobody in 1920s Paris or New York had a searchable database of European nobility on their person. What was real was the education. He spoke several languages fluently. Accounts vary between 5 and 6, and included German, Czech, English, French, and Italian, and he could move between them mid-conversation. That mattered more than the title. A man who can switch to your language with your regional idioms sounds like a man from home. By the time American federal agents finished assembling his file, they had credited him with 47 aliases and around 45 arrests inside the United States alone. He was convicted of essentially nothing until 1935. That ratio, dozens of arrests, no convictions, is the single most useful fact about how he operated, and we'll come back to why. Before the tower, understand the method. Because the tower was not improvisation, it was the same procedure scaled up. Lustig left behind a list, usually printed as the 10 Commandments for con men. Read as advice for criminals, it's underwhelming. Read as a description of behavior, it's a schematic. The rules: be a patient listener, never look bored, wait for the other man to reveal his politics, then agree with them, wait for him to reveal his religious views, then hold the same ones. Hint at conversation about sex, but don't pursue it unless he shows interest first. Never discuss illness unless he raises a health concern himself. Never pry into a man's personal circumstances, he'll tell you eventually. Never boast. Never look untidy, never get drunk. Notice what is missing. There is no instruction on lying. There is no script, no cover story, no clever line. 9 of the 10 are instructions to shut up and mirror. The con man in this system doesn't persuade the mark of anything. He arranges conditions in which the mark persuades himself and then gets out of the way, which is considerably harder work than it sounds, and explains why most people who try this are caught within a fortnight. The second half of the system was the exit. Lustig's targets were selected for a specific quality. They had to be people for whom being robbed was less painful than being seen to have been robbed. Wealthy businessmen, bank managers, buyers of illegal things, men whose standing in a community rested on a reputation for shrewdness. When the theft is discovered, that reputation becomes the con man's insurance policy, and it is a very good one. It is free, it never lapses, and it is enforced by the victim. His most repeated con was a machine, and the machine is worth explaining in full because everything he ever did is contained in it. He called it the Romanian money box. It was a wooden case, fitted with rollers, brass dials, and levers, and it did precisely nothing. The pitch was that it was a currency duplicating machine, capable of reproducing a banknote exactly. Here's the mechanism of the fraud. Lustig would load the box in advance with 2 genuine $100 bills concealed inside. He'd demonstrate for the mark, insert a real $100 bill, turn the dials, and explain, with visible reluctance, as though giving away a trade secret, that the chemical process required 6 hours. 6 hours later, out came 2 bills, both genuine because both were the ones he'd hidden. The mark would take them to a bank. The bank would confirm they were real because they were real. Then Lustig would allow himself to be talked into selling the box, typically for tens of thousands of dollars, and typically only after resisting. The buyer would go home and run the machine. 6 hours later, the second hidden bill emerged. 12 hours in, he had produced $200 and had a very expensive wooden box full of rollers. That 12-hour delay is the entire design. It isn't a flaw in the con. It is the con, a built-in head start purchased by the mark, in the currency of his own optimism. Lustig was routinely on a train or a ship before the customer had finished being pleased with himself. One documented sale gives you the flavor of what came next. He sold a box to a Texas sheriff. The sheriff, unlike most victims, tracked him down, reportedly to a Chicago hotel. Lustig did not run. He explained that the sheriff had simply been operating the machine incorrectly, offered a full refund on the spot, and paid it in cash. The cash was counterfeit. The sheriff went home, spent it, and was arrested for passing forged notes. In 1922 in Missouri, Lustig demonstrated the exit strategy in its purest form. He bought a derelict farm, paying with $22,000 in Liberty bonds, U.S. government war bonds, effectively a bearer investment that could be cashed. He then persuaded the bank handling the sale to convert a further block of bonds into cash for him, arguing he needed working capital. In the handover, envelopes were swapped. Lustig left with both the bonds and roughly $10,000 in cash. The bank realized quickly and had him arrested. This is where it stops being a theft and starts being a lesson. Lustig pointed out, reasonably, that a public prosecution would inform every depositor in the town that this bank could be relieved of $10,000 by a stranger with an envelope. The bank dropped the charges. Lustig then requested compensation for the inconvenience of his arrest, and the bank paid him a further $1,000 to leave. He didn't beat the legal system, he simply made the reputational cost of using it higher than the loss. Hold that thought for approximately 3 minutes of runtime. Now the tower, and the first thing to establish is that the pitch was not absurd. That's the part usually skipped. The Eiffel Tower was built for the 1889 World's Fair. It was designed as a temporary structure. Gustave Eiffel held a 20-year concession, after which ownership reverted to the city of Paris, and the original expectation in some quarters was demolition. Large sections of the French cultural establishment loathed it. A public letter signed by prominent artists and writers had denounced it before it was even finished. What saved it was not affection, it was that the tower turned out to be an excellent radio antenna, and later a useful military transmitter. By 1925, it was 36 years old, permanently exposed to weather, and expensive. Iron requires paint, and 7,000 tons of it requires a great deal of paint, on a schedule, forever. The Paris press was running stories about the cost of upkeep and the poor condition of the structure. Lustig read one of those articles. That is the origin of the entire scheme. A man reading a newspaper and noticing that the public had been prepared to believe something. He had stationery forged, not a document, stationery, official French government letterhead, on which he could produce any document he needed in the correct format with the correct ministry named. He assigned himself a title, Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. This is a better choice than it first appears. It is senior enough to plausibly control state property, obscure enough that no scrap dealer would recognize the incumbent, and attached to a ministry that genuinely had jurisdiction over the tower because the tower carried radio and telegraph equipment. The lie is anchored to a true fact. That is the pattern throughout. He then identified 6 of the largest scrap metal dealers in Paris and sent each a letter on the forged letterhead inviting them to a confidential meeting at the Hôtel de Crillon, one of the most prestigious hotels in the city, on the Place de la Concorde. Government business discussed at a government-appropriate address. The pitch, delivered in May 1925, was this. The Eiffel Tower had reached the end of its serviceable life. Maintenance costs had become indefensible. The city intended to dismantle it and sell the metal, approximately 7,000 tons of wrought iron, as scrap. The government was inviting sealed bids from a small group of qualified dealers, and it had to be secret. The public would object. Announcing the demolition of the tower prematurely would produce a scandal, so no man in the room was to discuss this with anyone. The secrecy requirement performs 3 jobs at once. It explains why the deal isn't in the newspapers. It flatters the 6 men by making them insiders. And it disables the one action that would end the con instantly, which is any of them phoning the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs to check. He then took them on a tour of the tower in a hired limousine, which cost him very little and confirmed everything. He did not sell to the highest bidder. He watched the room and selected the man who most needed the deal to be real. That was André Poisson. Poisson was successful but an outsider in Parisian business circles, not part of the established network, conscious of it, and looking for the kind of contract that would settle the question permanently. Winning a confidential government commission to dismantle the most famous structure in France would do that. Poisson's wife was suspicious. Her objections, as recorded, were structural rather than specific. Why the secrecy? Why this hotel? Why the hurry? Why a man none of them had heard of? Lustig's response to a marked suspicion was never reassurance, it was escalation. He arranged a private meeting with Poisson and confessed, not to fraud, to corruption. He explained that he was a senior civil servant on a modest government salary, surrounded daily by enormous sums of other people's money, expected to maintain appearances he could not afford. He implied, with the appropriate discomfort, that the contract could be directed to the right dealer and that a personal payment would help him make that determination. This resolved every doubt Poisson's wife had raised. The secrecy now made sense. It was cover for a kickback. The unfamiliar official made sense. Corrupt men keep low profiles. The urgency made sense. And critically, Poisson was no longer being asked to trust a stranger. He was being offered proof of the stranger's dishonesty, which is a far more convincing thing than a reference. Poisson paid. He paid for the scrap rights, and he paid the bribe. The exact figure has never been established with certainty. It's typically reported in the region of 1,000,000 francs, because of what happened next. Lustig took a suitcase of cash and a train to Vienna. Poisson discovered the fraud within days. He did not go to the police. Consider the statement he would have had to make, that he had bought the Eiffel Tower, that he had bought it from a man he met once, that he had bribed that man, committing a crime in the process, to obtain a demolition contract for the National Monument, that his wife had told him not to. He would have been ruined by the reporting of it, not by the loss. So the loss stayed private. Lustig, sitting in Vienna reading French newspapers and finding no mention of himself whatsoever, drew the obvious conclusion. He went back to Paris. Same forged stationery, same ministry, same title, same hotel, a new set of scrap dealers, and the same tower, which had been standing there the entire time. Unsold, unscrapped, and by now, presumably a little insulted. This is the part of the story that is hardened into legend, so here is the distinction worth making. That he returned and ran the con a second time is well established. That the second sale was completed is not. In most accounts, the second attempt broke down before payment. This mark went to the police rather than to his bank. And Lustig, who appears to have had an excellent instinct for the moment a room changes temperature, left France for the United States. So the honest version of the headline is this. He sold the Eiffel Tower once and attempted it twice. And the reason he could attempt it twice is that his first victim paid, in silence, for the privilege of not being laughed at, which is arguably a better story than the one on the poster. In America, he made an approach that reads as suicidal and was, in fact, actuarially sound. Lustig went to Al Capone in Chicago and asked him to invest $50,000 in a deal, promising to double it inside 60 days. Capone gave him the money. Lustig then put it in a safe deposit box and did nothing with it for 2 months. At the end of the 60 days, he returned to Capone, produced the entire $50,000, and apologized. The deal had collapsed. He was returning the investment in full, and he was, he said, personally embarrassed. He had been counting on his share. Capone, who had presumably budgeted emotionally for either a doubling or a homicide, was confronted with a third outcome he had no procedure for. A man with a reputation for dishonesty handing back money that nobody could have made him hand back. He gave Lustig $5,000 out of sympathy for a straight dealer who had had a run of bad luck. That $5,000 was the objective from the beginning. The con was not the investment. The con was the honesty. Lustig had identified a man for whom the rarest available commodity was a person who would not steal from him, manufactured that commodity artificially, and sold it at a 10% yield, risk-adjusted, in 60 days. A note on sourcing, because this channel does not do fairy tales. The Eiffel Tower fraud, the counterfeiting operation, the arrest, the escape, and the sentence are documented in Secret Service files, court records, and prison records. The Capone episode is not. It comes down to us largely through Lustig's own account and a 1961 biography built on it. Given the subject's profession, the possibility that the Capone story is itself a Lustig product should be left on the table. The thing that destroyed him was not a con, it was a business. In the early 1930s, Lustig went into counterfeiting with William Watts, a Nebraska pharmacist and highly skilled engraver. Watts produced $100 plates of genuine quality. The operation reportedly pushed forged notes into circulation at a rate of around $100,000 a month, distributed across the country, enough volume that the Secret Service internally nicknamed the notes after him. This was a category error, and it's worth naming precisely. Every previous Lustig scheme required a victim who wanted to stay quiet. Counterfeiting has no victim who feels foolish. It has the Treasury, which feels nothing and never stops. It also, unlike a wooden box, produces physical evidence in industrial quantities, distributed through people he did not control. He had traded a business model with a built-in silencer for one with a paper trail. The end came through the one variable he'd never systematized. Lustig was involved with a woman, Billie Mae, who discovered he was also involved with William Watts's girlfriend. She telephoned the authorities. In 1935, federal agents arrested him on a New York street. He was carrying no counterfeit money, he was carrying a key. It opened a locker at a subway station, and inside the locker were roughly $51,000 in forged notes and the printing plates. 45 arrests, no convictions, and it ends with a key in a coat pocket and a jealous phone call. He was held at the federal detention headquarters on West Street in Manhattan. The day before his trial was due to begin, on the 1st of September, 1935, he escaped. The method was a rope of bed sheets, 9 of them, knotted, lowered from a window. The detail that keeps the story alive is what he did on the way down. Descending the exterior of a federal detention building in daylight, in full view of the street, Lustig stopped, took out a cloth, and wiped the windows as he passed them. Pedestrians who looked up saw a window cleaner. He reached the ground, bowed to onlookers, and walked away. He was recaptured 27 days later in Pittsburgh. He pleaded guilty. The sentence for the counterfeiting operation was 20 years. A further 5 years was added for the escape to be served consecutively, 25 in total. He was sent to Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay and registered as prisoner number 300. There was no bribe to offer, no room to read, no mark to select. The entire apparatus he had built, languages, mirroring, patience, the reputational insurance policy, required other people making decisions. Alcatraz was specifically designed to remove that variable. He served 12 years. In 1947, he became seriously ill and was transferred to the Federal Prison Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, where he died of pneumonia on the 11th of March, aged 57. His death certificate recorded his occupation as apprentice salesman. If you want another operator the public decided to find charming, watch our video on Crazy Joe Gallo, the mobster New York's artists adored. It's on screen now.